Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. In our modern world of therapy, medication, and self-help books, it can be easy to dismiss the idea that there is some monster living inside all of us just waiting to break free. But this novella by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1886, explores exactly that idea. It's a dark tale of science, sin, and the duality of man, which was way ahead of its time and still manages to terrify readers even now. Let's jump right into it. In Victorian London, we meet the well-respected Dr. Henry Jekyll, a man who's beloved by his peers and enjoys a life of luxury and leisure. He's kind, he's generous, and he's seemingly very put together. Basically, everything you'd want your doctor to be. But there's a secret he's been hiding from the world. As a young man, he'd had an alter ego, Edward Hyde, who he'd made a name for with a series of petty crimes he'd committed. Luckily, no one remembered them, so he was able to reinvent himself and live the rest of his life under the alias Dr. Jekyll. He even went as far as legally changing his name to protect his good reputation. But now, years later, he finds himself inexplicably drawn back to Hyde. What starts as an overwhelming urge quickly turns into full-blown obsession, taking over his thoughts and separating him from his friends and colleagues. He tries to fight it, but something inside of him is too strong to resist. And soon he begins to feel like he's being pulled toward his old life of crime. Dr. Jekyll has always prided himself on his rationality and his control over his emotions. So when these feelings come out of nowhere, he's shocked. Of course, in reality, it's perfectly normal to have urges that pop up from nowhere and take us by surprise. But for Dr. Jekyll, this is completely unhinged. He throws himself into research, attempting to find a scientific explanation for what he's going through. He looks at case studies of criminals and compares their psychological profiles with his own. But no matter how hard he tries, he can't seem to understand why he feels this way. As the story progresses, his obsession only gets worse. He spends all of his time locked away in his laboratory, neglecting his friends and family in the process. Even though they're worried sick about him, no one dares to go in after him. They know he's not himself and are afraid he may hurt someone. But then one night, all of that changes. As people are making their way home from a night out, they hear screams coming from Dr. Jekyll's house. At first, they think it's just some drunken revelry. After all, Jekyll was known for throwing some pretty wild parties. But the screams get louder and more intense. And soon the crowd gathers outside his house to try and figure out what's going on. One man even climbs up to Dr. Jekyll's window and sees something that makes his blood run cold. Inside, he sees the man he's been looking for, Edward Hyde, covered in blood and holding a bloody cane. When the onlookers try to break down the door, Hyde runs away, leaving Dr. Jekyll alone in his laboratory. The police arrive and find out that he's passed away. They don't know how he died, but it seems clear that he didn't pass away peacefully. This is where the story takes a turn for the strange. When Dr. Jekyll's body is discovered, it becomes clear that he's not the person the townspeople thought he was. In fact, he was much younger than they expected. Turns out Hyde hadn't killed Dr. Jekyll, but rather Dr. Jekyll had killed Hyde. You see, Dr. Jekyll had managed to create a drug that allowed him to transform into his alter ego, but it wasn't exactly what he'd hoped it would be. While he thought he could control the transformations and become whoever he wanted to be, he soon found out that wasn't possible. In fact, once he took the drug, he had no control over whether he would turn into Jekyll or Hyde. That's why he spent so much time in his lab, trying to find the right balance of ingredients that would allow him to switch between the two at will. But it was a dangerous game and one that ultimately cost him his life. So it wasn't that Dr. Jekyll had been taken over by his evil side, but rather that he tried to suppress it for so long that his body had revolted against him. When he finally let Hyde out to play, it was too late. The damage had already been done, and he couldn't change back. Now, this novella was way ahead of its time. Back in 1886, the idea that there were multiple personalities within a person was unheard of. We now know that Dr. Jekyll was most likely suffering from dissociative identity disorder, which is a real mental condition that causes people to have different personalities. But back then, this was all very new, and the medical community wasn't ready to accept that this was a possibility. And this isn't the only way that the story was ahead of its time. It also explores the idea of repressed memories, which is another concept that we're more familiar with today than we were back then. Basically, Dr. Jekyll tried to bury his past with Edward Hyde and pretend like he never existed. But his subconscious mind never forgot about Hyde and eventually brought him back in the form of nightmares and intrusive thoughts. Another way that this story was ahead of its time was its exploration of good and evil. Throughout history, people have debated whether humans are inherently good or evil. Are we born innocent and corrupted by society? Or do we enter the world with the capacity for both good and evil? This novella suggests that we're all capable of great things, but also that we have the capacity for evil. It's why Dr. Jekyll was so troubled by his transformation. He wasn't just becoming someone else, he was becoming the embodiment of everything he hated about himself. And if that's not enough to show you just how ahead of its time this book was, let me remind you that it was written during a time when women were still fighting for the right to vote. Yet the author uses the word lesbian in chapter 2. In the story, Dar Lanyon is describing Dr. Jekyll's strange behavior and says that he used to frequent the company of the infamous homosexual, Seigneur Casabong, and even went so far as to call him his intimate friend. Now, while this does seem shocking considering the time period, it's actually not that surprising. See, Robert Louis Stevenson himself was bisexual. And throughout his stories, you can see that he explored themes of sexuality in a way that was very progressive for the time period. He also wrote a story called The Love of My Life, which features a lesbian relationship. So it's clear that he was interested in exploring all kinds of love, not just romantic love between a man and a woman. Now, when you think of the main characters in this story, you probably imagine a distinguished gentleman in a top hat, smoking a cigar. And that's all thanks to Hollywood. You see, when the novella was originally published, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was never meant to be read as an allegory for homosexuality. Instead, Robert Louis Stevenson was writing about a married couple who were once lovers, but whose marriage had become strained. In fact, there are parts of the novella that clearly indicate that Dr. Jekyll is thinking about his wife. Near the end of the story, for example, he writes in his journal that he must make a full confession to her, implying that she knows nothing about what he's been up to. And when he dies, he leaves her everything he has, including the formula for the drug that turns him into Hyde. It was only after the story was published that readers started to interpret it as being about a man's struggle with his alter ego. But that's not the only way this story has been interpreted. Throughout history, people have interpreted Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in different ways based on what was going on in the world at the time. For example, after World War II, many started to see the story as an allegory for Nazi Germany. They saw Dr. Jekyll as representing the German people before Hitler came into power, and Mr. Hyde as representing the Nazi regime. This interpretation gained even more traction when Walt Disney released his version of the story in 1931, which featured a very Nazi-esque looking villain. Of course, this isn't the only adaptation of the story. There are dozens of movies, TV shows, and plays based on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I think we can all agree that the original is the best. Robert Louis Stevenson was a master of suspense, and he kept me guessing until the very end. Plus, the themes he explored in the novella are still relevant today. We're still trying to understand the duality of man and what it is that makes us tick. So if you haven't read this novella yet, I highly recommend that you do. Just be warned, it'll keep you up at night. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. I hope you have a wonderful day,